From the first 999 call to 3 arrests, it took just 72 hours. But what police uncovered in those 3 days didn't just solve a murder in a Sheffield park. It dismantled a county lines operation, exposed teenage enforcers, and led them all the way to the men at the top. This is the Sacad Ali case, and it started with a phone call no one should have answered. March 9, 2024. Ponderosa Park, Sheffield. A patch of rugged green space wedged between tower blocks and woodland. Silent. Empty. Unforgiving. At 5:09 in the morning, paramedics pronounced 24-year-old Sacad Ali dead at the scene. 16 stab wounds. One had severed his femoral artery, leading to catastrophic blood loss. But this wasn't a random attack. This wasn't a fight that got out of hand. Sacad had been lured there, set up, ambushed by 2 boys. One just 16 years old, the other 17, both armed with machetes. And the person who made the call that brought him to that park. She was waiting in the shadows, watching it all unfold. Within 72 hours, all 3 were in custody. But what detectives found didn't stop at murder. It reached into a drug network named after a heavyweight boxer, run by men in their 20s, and enforced by children barely old enough to leave school. This is the story of how one killing exposed an entire system. But to understand how it all unraveled so fast, we need to go back to the call that started it. Welcome to UK True Crime Files, where we dig into the cases that scar Britain's communities, giving voice to the victims at their heart. If you're new here, please subscribe. Your support keeps these stories coming straight to your feed. I'd leave a comment below with your thoughts on this case. It starts conversations that matter. 4:07 a.m., Saturday, March 9, 2024. Sacad Ali was at a friend's flat in Netherthorpe, Sheffield. The night was winding down. He was relaxed, safe. Then his phone rang. On the other end was Rebecca Moore, 25 years old, an escort, a regular user of Class A drugs, and someone Sacad knew. She told him she wanted to buy, hinted at something more, something intimate. Asked him to meet her at Ponderosa Park, just a short walk away. To Sacad, it sounded routine. Another call-out, another sale. But it wasn't. Hours earlier, in a cramped flat on Springvale Walk, belonging to a frail, bedridden man known only as Mr. A. A plan had been taking shape. Rebecca Moore was there. So were 2 others. Barney Griffin, 17 years old. Jack Douglas, just 16. The flat had become a regular base for them. Business, dealing, and violence. That night, the conversation turned to Sacad Ali. He'd been dealing drugs on their patch, the Frank Lines territory, a county lines operation named after a famous boxer. One of several running through Sheffield streets. There was the Bruno line, the AJ line. But the Frank line, it was the most ruthless. And Sacad wasn't one of theirs. According to evidence later presented in court, Griffin and Douglas saw this as more than bad business. It was an insult. A violation, something that couldn't go unanswered. They already had a reputation. Both of them patrolled the Ponderosa area with machetes, intimidating rivals, guarding the Frank Lines turf like soldiers on a battlefield. Griffin had no previous criminal record. Douglas had a single caution for possession with intent to supply Class B drugs. These weren't hardened criminals, they were teenagers, pulled into a system that handed them blades and told them who the enemy was. But they needed a way to get Sacad alone. That's where Rebecca Moore came in. She knew him. He'd sold to her before. He trusted her. Or at least trusted her enough to answer the phone. The plan was simple. Moore would call him, lure him out with the promise of a sale, maybe something more. And when he arrived, Griffin and Douglas would be waiting. Sacad left his friend's flat and walked into the night. He had no idea 2 teenagers were already in position, armed, hidden in the dark, waiting for him to step into the trap. Ponderosa Park isn't your typical park. There are no benches, no playgrounds, no well-lit paths. It's a rugged stretch of green space, cutting between blocks of flats and patches of woodland. In daylight, it's quiet. At night, it's silent, isolated, and in the early hours of a cold March morning, unforgiving. Sacad Ali arrived just after 4 a.m. He met Rebecca Moore on a footpath near a grassy clearing. They spoke briefly. The conversation was short, unremarkable. And then, Griffin and Douglas emerged from the shadows. Sacad saw them immediately. He pulled out his own knife, a large blade later described in court. But he didn't move toward them. He didn't threaten. He backed away. Witnesses later said they heard him shout, "Leave it." He was trying to de-escalate, trying to get out. But Griffin and Douglas didn't stop. They charged, fast, coordinated, both swinging their machetes, and the assault spilled across the footpath and into the open grass. Sacad fought back, tried to defend himself, but he was outnumbered, outmatched. Witnesses from nearby flats heard the screaming, the chaos. Some saw movement in the dark, the shape of a man staggering, bleeding heavily. Rebecca Moore stood about 30 meters away. She didn't intervene. She didn't call for help. She just watched. And then, as Sacad collapsed to the ground, she walked away. The attack lasted minutes, maybe less. 16 stab wounds. The pathologist would later confirm that the injuries came from multiple weapons. 2 attackers, 2 blades, 1 coordinated assault. One of the wounds struck Sacad's upper thigh, severing the femoral artery. The blood loss was catastrophic. Immediate. Sacad tried to get up. His body wouldn't let him, and he collapsed again. And this time, he didn't move. At 5:09 a.m., paramedics arrived at Ponderosa Park. They pronounced Sacad Ali dead at the scene. He was 24 years old, known on the streets as Ghost. To his family, he was a son, a brother. And within hours, police had cordoned off the park. Forensic teams moved in. CCTV footage was being pulled from every nearby block, every corner shop, every road junction. But they already had something most murder investigations don't get this early. They had CCTV, and they had 2 names. By first light on the 9th of March, detectives knew this wasn't random. The scene told them that, the location told them that, and within hours, the CCTV confirmed it. South Yorkshire police moved fast. Forensic teams secured Ponderosa Park. Officers began pulling footage from every camera in the area. Tower blocks, corner shops, traffic junctions, doorbell cameras, and the footage gave them exactly what they needed. 2 young males captured fleeing the scene on foot shortly after the time of the murder. Their clothing matched early witness descriptions. Their movements deliberate, coordinated. But here's the thing, police didn't just have faces on a screen, they already had names. Barney Griffin, 17 years old, Jack Douglas, 16, both were already on the radar. Not for murder, but for their involvement in low-level drug activity. Both had been seen operating in the Ponderosa area. And both had clear connections to something bigger. The Frank Line. Detectives began tracking their movements from that night. Cell tower data, more doorbell footage, and witness statements from people who'd seen them in the hours before and after the killing. And then, a crucial piece of evidence. CCTV captured all 3 suspects, Griffin, Douglas, and Rebecca Moore, near Albion Street, shortly after 5 a.m. Just a few hundred meters from where Sacad Ali lay dying. The timeline was locking into place, the digital trail was clear, the witness accounts were consistent. Barney Griffin had no previous criminal record. He'd been a promising footballer once. Jack Douglas had a single caution: possession with intent to supply Class B substances. Cannabis, nothing violent. These weren't seasoned criminals. They were teenagers from Sheffield estates pulled into a world that gave them status, cash, and weapons, and told them that territory was worth killing for. But detectives weren't just looking at the 2 boys, they were looking at Rebecca Moore. Because someone had made that phone call, someone had lured Sacad Ali to that park, and someone had stood there, watching, as 2 teenagers stabbed him 16 times, on Tuesday, March 12, 2024, just 72 hours after Sacad died. Barney Griffin and Jack Douglas walked into Shepcote Lane police station. Some reports say it was voluntary, others suggest they'd been tipped off, that they knew the net was closing and they came in to control how it happened. Either way, detectives were ready. Both boys were arrested on suspicion of murder, and in the interview rooms, they said nothing. No comment, no comment, no comment. Silence, start to finish. That same day, officers moved on Rebecca Moore. She was located in the Burngreave area of Sheffield. But when police approached her, she gave a false name, Lauren Smith. But the officer already had her photograph on his phone. The confirmation came back within minutes. She was identified, arrested, and taken into custody on suspicion of murder. But Rebecca Moore, she couldn't stay quiet for long. In the days following her arrest, Rebecca Moore was held on remand, waiting for charges, waiting for trial. And while Griffin and Douglas stayed silent, Moore started talking, not to detectives, not in formal interviews, but to other inmates, in casual conversation. In moments, she thought no one important was listening. Prison staff were. According to officers working on her wing, Moore was overheard in the showers one afternoon, laughing with another inmate. She said she was going to play the mental health card, that it would help her case, that she could use it to distance herself from what happened. And then she said something else. My boys stabbed him because he was on my turf. My boys. My turf, not their turf, not the Frankline's turf. Hers. That overheard conversation was logged, documented, and it would become a key piece of evidence when the case went to trial. Because it wasn't just an admission of knowledge, it was an admission of ownership, of control. Rebecca Moore hadn't just lured Sacad Ali to Ponderosa Park. She saw herself as part of the operation, as someone with territory to defend, as someone who gave the order, even if Griffin and Douglas were the ones who carried it out. Within days, all three were formally charged. Barney Griffin, murder and possession of a bladed weapon. Jack Douglas, murder, and possession of a bladed weapon. Rebecca Moore, murder. The trap had been set, the ambush had been executed, and now the evidence was locked in. CCTV placing them near the scene. Witness testimony, digital tracking, forensic analysis of the weapons and the wounds, and Moore's own words, captured in a prison shower. But while the case against Griffin, Douglas, and Moore was being built, detectives were already asking a bigger question. If these three were just the muscle, the enforcers, the foot soldiers on the ground, then who was running the operation? Who armed two teenagers with machetes and sent them out to patrol a patch of Sheffield like it was a war zone? Who built the Frank Line? And were they still out there? To understand what Griffin and Douglas were enforcing, you need to understand what a county line actually is. It's not a gang in the traditional sense, it's a business model. Drug networks that radiate out from major cities into smaller towns, coastal areas, rural communities. They use dedicated phone lines, burner phones, to take orders. Dealers are sent out to deliver, and the people doing the delivering, often children, runners, enforcers, exploited teenagers who are promised money, status, protection, and handed a knife or a machete and told to defend the line. By 2024, Sheffield wasn't just a city built on steel. It was a city scarred by county lines. The Frank Line, the Bruno Line, the AJ Line, all named after heavyweight boxers, all operating with ruthless efficiency, all using kids. But the Frank Line, it had made its mark. It didn't just send product, it sent a message. This turf belongs to us. And if you're dealing here without permission, there will be consequences. Barney Griffin and Jack Douglas weren't recruited because they had criminal records. Griffin didn't have one. Douglas had a single caution for cannabis. They were recruited because they were available, because they were vulnerable, because they lived in the right postcode, knew the right people, and needed the money. Griffin had been a promising footballer. Douglas, the same. But somewhere along the way, the pitch became the estate. The team became the line, and the competition became territorial warfare. They were handed machetes, told to patrol Ponderosa, told who the enemies were, and when Sacad Ali started dealing on their patch, they were told what to do about it. This is how county lines operate. They don't need hardened criminals, they need bodies. They need teenagers desperate enough, loyal enough, or scared enough to follow orders. And when those orders include violence, the system doesn't care, because to the people running the line, Griffin and Douglas were disposable. Sacad Ali's crime, in their eyes, wasn't that he was a dealer. It was that he was dealing without permission, without paying tribute, without acknowledging the Frank Line's control. And for that, they decided he had to die. The boys were in custody. Moore was awaiting trial, but the people who armed them, who sent them out, who built the Frank Line and profited from every sale, every threat, every act of violence committed in its name, they were still out there, and South Yorkshire police were about to bring them in. On the 24th of May, 2024, Barney Griffin and Jack Douglas appeared at Sheffield Crown Court. Both pleaded guilty. Murder, possession of bladed weapons, no trial, no cross-examination, no denials. Two teenagers admitting to a killing that began with a trap and ended with 16 stab wounds in a park. But Rebecca Moore, she wasn't ready to follow their lead. She pleaded not guilty, claimed she didn't know knives would be used, said she wasn't part of any plan, that she'd only witnessed a glimpse of what happened, and had no idea it would end the way it did. That decision sent the case to trial, and over the next 2 weeks, the jury would hear every step of what led to Sacad Ali's death in the early hours of March 9th. Moore's trial began on the 28th of October, 2024. The prosecution didn't waste time. They laid out the timeline. Her presence at Mr. IA's flat the night before the murder. The conversation with Griffin and Douglas about Sacad dealing on their patch. The phone call she made at 4:07 a.m., luring him to Ponderosa Park. They played CCTV clips. Footage placing her within walking distance of the scene, just after 5 a.m. footage showing her leaving the area with Griffin and Douglas. They called witnesses. A woman Moore had visited after the killing. A drug user who testified that Moore had confessed. She told her she'd set the whole thing up, that it was to protect the Frank line. And then, the prison officers took the stand. They recounted the conversation overheard in the showers. Moore laughing, talking about playing the mental health card, saying, "My boys stabbed him because he was on my turf." Moore's defense tried to push back. He argued that she'd only caught a glimpse of the attack, that she didn't know it would turn violent, that she wasn't responsible for what Griffin and Douglas chose to do. But the jury didn't buy it. On the 11th of November, 2024, after more than 2 weeks of evidence, the verdict came in. Guilty. Rebecca Moore had played her part. She didn't hold a blade, but she put Sacad Ali in that park. She set the trap, and she walked away while he bled out. 17 days later, on the 28th of November, all 3 defendants stood together for sentencing. Judge Jeremy Richardson KC addressed the court. He made it clear this wasn't just about 3 individuals. This was about the toxic pipeline pulling children into drug lines and knife crime, and the devastation it left behind. Barney Griffin, now 18 years old, was sentenced to detention at His Majesty's pleasure, the juvenile equivalent of a life sentence. Minimum term, 16 years. Jack Douglas, still only 17, received the same sentence. Minimum term, 15 years. Rebecca Moore, for her role in luring Sacad to his death, was given life imprisonment. Minimum term, 15 years before she could even be considered for parole. 3 lives effectively over, 1 for setting the trap, 2 for carrying it out. But while the courtroom doors closed on Griffin, Douglas and Moore, South Yorkshire Police were preparing for a second wave of arrests, and this time they weren't going after enforcers. They were going after the architects. In the weeks following the sentencing, South Yorkshire Police and regional organised crime units carried out a series of coordinated raids. 10 properties, all hit simultaneously, across Burton-on-Trent and surrounding areas. These weren't low-level users. These weren't street dealers caught with a few raps in their pockets. These were suppliers, organisers, men with burner phones, stockpiles of product, and clear links to multiple county lines, including the Frank line. Among those arrested were 2 key figures: Joseph Giran, Christopher Zemer. Both 23 years old, they weren't teenagers on the streets, patrolling estates with machetes. They were the ones running the operation, the ones naming the lines after boxers, the ones recruiting kids like Griffin and Douglas to enforce their territory. In April 2024, following months of surveillance, both were charged with conspiracy to supply Class A drugs. The raid seized over £20,000 worth of crack cocaine and heroin, burner phones, evidence linking them not just to the Frank line, but to the Bruno line and the AJ line as well. These weren't isolated operations, they were part of a coordinated network, supplying Sheffield, exploiting vulnerable teenagers, and profiting from every sale, every threat, every act of violence committed in their name. Joseph Giran was sentenced to 6 years in prison. Christopher Zemer received 7, and with their convictions, the Frank line collapsed. The infrastructure fell apart, the supply chain broke, the phone lines went dead. But even more significant than the product seized was what the case revealed. Because this wasn't just about drugs, it was about a system that turned children into soldiers, that handed machetes to teenagers and told them territory was worth killing for. That made boys like Barney Griffin and Jack Douglas believe they were protecting something, when really they were just disposable. Giran and Zemer built that system. They profited from it. And when Sacad Ali died in Ponderosa Park, they were the ones who created the conditions that made it possible. In less than a year, a single murder had brought down an entire network. But what about the boy who died? Sacad Ali was 24 years old, known on the streets as Ghost. But to his family, he was a son, a brother, someone they loved. His death left them shattered. Those were the judge's words during sentencing, shattered. Yes, Sacad was a dealer. He was involved in the drug trade. He was operating in dangerous territory, in a city where turf wars were turning fatal. But he was also a young man trying to survive in a world where territory, of violence and survival, had become currency. And on the morning of March 9th, 2024, that world took his life. But Sacad wasn't the only victim in this case. Barney Griffin and Jack Douglas were victims too. Not in the same way. Not with the same outcome, but victims nonetheless. They were teenagers. Promising footballers once, boys with futures that didn't have to include machetes, county lines, or life sentences. But they were groomed, recruited, handed weapons and told that protecting a patch of Sheffield was worth killing for. The system that built the Frank Line didn't just destroy Sacad Ali, it consumed Griffin and Douglas too. It took their childhoods, their choices, their futures, and turned them into enforcers for men who saw them as disposable. Now they'll spend the next 15 to 16 years behind bars. And even when they're released, if they're released, they'll carry what they did for the rest of their lives. Rebecca Moore, a drug user, caught in the same cycle, exploited by the same system she helped enforce, now serving life, minimum 15 years. The Frank Line didn't just kill one person, it destroyed everyone it touched. And this isn't unique to Sheffield. Across the UK, county lines are responsible for thousands of crimes every year. Children as young as 12 are being recruited. Entire communities are being destabilized. Families are being torn apart. The National Crime Agency estimates there are over 1,000 active county lines operating across England and Wales. And behind every line, there are kids like Griffin and Douglas, and victims like Sacad Ali. This case exposed one network. But it's a reminder that the problem is far bigger than one city, one line, one murder. From the phone call at 4:07 a.m. to the arrest 72 hours later, to the collapse of the Frank Line and the sentencing of everyone involved. Justice was served, but justice doesn't bring Sacad Ali back, and it doesn't erase what Griffin, Douglas and Moore became. Even with convictions, trials and sentences, some questions remain. Were there others involved in the planning that night at Mr. A's flat? People who knew what was going to happen, but were never charged. How many other operations did Joseph Giran and Christopher Zemer run before they were finally caught? How many other teenagers did they recruit, arm and send out onto the streets? And how many other Sacad Alis are out there right now, caught between rival lines and trying to survive in a system that sees them as obstacles, not people? We don't have those answers, and we may never will. What we do know is this. All convictions in this case are final. Barney Griffin, Jack Douglas, Rebecca Moore, Joseph Giran, and Christopher Zemer have all been sentenced. This reporting is based on court proceedings, South Yorkshire police statements, and witness testimony presented during trial. The case is closed, but the county lines crisis is not. Sacad Ali's name should be more than a case number, more than a headline, more than a statistic in a national crime report. His death exposed a system. It brought down a network. It put dangerous people behind bars. But it also reminds us that behind every county lines case, there's a person, a family, a life that was cut short. And there are teenagers, and some barely old enough to leave school, being handed weapons and told that violence is the answer. This story matters, not just because of what happened in Ponderosa Park on a cold March morning, but because it's still happening. In Sheffield, in Birmingham, in London, in towns and cities across the UK. And the more we understand it, the better chance we have of stopping it. If this case gave you clarity,